Namaste everyone, I'm Roshan Karyappa and today I'm thrilled to be hosting one of India's most beloved authors, Amish Tripathi. I guess that's as good an introduction as any, but let me also say this, there are very few authors in the world with as much of a cross-generational appeal as Amish has today. In fact, in the lead up to this conversation, I had uncles and aunts, nieces and nephews who reached out to me and reminded me multiple times how much of a privilege this was to host him, right? So, hi Amish, welcome to the Bharat Varta podcast.
Thanks, Roshan. Thank you for having me. Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, so before we begin, I must also thank you for one other reason. I think my dad and mom will finally find out what the hell I'm doing with these podcasts. Yeah, so
where are you based, my friend?
I'm based in Bangalore, Amish.
In Bangalore. Okay.
What
I
about
assume
yourself?
you're a Kurgi.
Yes, I am Kurgi.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So you are based in London, I assume.
I'm based in London. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So you're just starting out your day. So much of the conversation today will be centered around the book. Guys, I mean, it's a fantastic book. Please get it. It's a riveting read and it's a short read as well. 2-3 sittings, you should be able to finish.
I have a copy too.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll center the conversation around the book, which is, as I mentioned, a fantastic book. In fact, I mean, I got goosebumps at certain points in the book. I won't mention which points. I don't want to give away too much on the book, right? But let's set some context before that. Maybe if you could help us understand your journey from banker to author and the process of discovering your own Swadharma.
Banker to author is only part of the journey. I wrote my first 2 books along with my job. I resigned only after my second book, and that was a very practical, pragmatic decision. Only when my royalty check became more than my salary. Middle class family, you know what it's like. So we have to be pragmatic, in our choices. So I think my banking career, you have my background is such that, and my grandfather was a pandit in Kashi, Banaras. I used to teach at BHU as well, maths and physics. He was professor of maths and physics. Both my parents are very religious. My grandfather on my father's side is who I was speaking of, and my grandmother on my mother's side was also a teacher.
Okay.
So our family had that atmosphere of Saraswati Vandana.
Steeped in tradition, education.
Deep respect for knowledge, for education. And as I always joke, not too much blessings of Goddess Lakshmi, but lots of blessings of Goddess Saraswati. But my parents were educated in the Hindi medium, right? So, you're young, you will not remember what India was like in those days. When my parents had to bring us up and earn money. If you didn't know good English, things were difficult.
Yeah.
And they had decided that the 4 of us, their children, 4 of us siblings, will not suffer what they suffered. So they sent us to convent schools, to boarding schools, to schools that were way beyond their income class and social class. They had practically no savings. All their money was invested only in the education of the 4 of us.
Right.
We would go to schools where, my friends would wear shoes that cost more than my father's monthly salary. Right? And their thing was very clear that you will learn English well, you will mix with that elite class so that you don't get intimidated by them. But at home, you will remember who you are. You will not forget who you are. So we had this very interesting mix. All 4 of us siblings, we are on 2 boats. At home, we are completely in our traditions and our culture.
Right.
Yoga, that's how I have all the knowledge that I have of our tradition. But in schools, we would go to schools where the elite guys were, right? And of course, and you can imagine, and kids from a social or economic background that was lower than the friends, it would also mean that we would get along with them, but we'd have a chip on our shoulder, right? Of course. That was the background I was in. So for us, all the 4 of us, being aware of the sacrifices that our parents had made. And our parents never hid those sacrifices from us. My mother always told us clearly what all sacrifices, and she expected us to be successful. She said, whatever field you choose is up to you, but whichever field you do choose, you guys will be number one in that field. Right? She was very clear on that. And so 4 of us had that fire in our belly that we are not going to be also rans in our life. We're going to achieve something. Right?
Fantastic.
So many of our career decisions would be taken with that thing. So I loved history as a child, but I was clear in the India I was growing up in, history, no career, nothing. It's not possible. So do the practical, logical thing. Do an MBA, become a corporate rat. That's what I did. I was a banker for 14 years. So that was why I got into banking. And I had it's not a dishonorable job. We're not, chori nahi kar rahe.
Bankers are not evil, yeah.
But it's not something that gives you purpose, right? It's not swadharma.
Right.
It pays the bills at the end of the month. You can feel like a success. You can meet your responsibilities. You can take care of your family. You can take care of your parents. Those things kind of drive you, right? So that was the background with which I got into banking. So now if you understand this background, then you have to understand how, the books for me was a bit like returning to my roots. Right?
Okay.
And which is why it was so special for me writing these books, and especially because I had done nothing creative in my younger days. I was a very academically oriented kid. I was also very active in sports, boxing, gymnastics, those kind of things. But I was never creative. Right? So this was, it was like I was living a dream. So I was writing my books just for myself. I genuinely wasn't thinking, kya hoga iska, kitab chalegi, nahi chalegi. I was just getting pleasure and purpose out of it. And I'm just lucky that that I can actually make enough money through this that I can do it full time. So that's sort of the journey.
So you're kind of the ideal guy to write about it, right? Given your upbringing and your background, I think you're sort of the ideal person. I can't think of another person who can kind of write these books, in my opinion, right? So a lot of what you write, and there's discussion and debate on, how we should interpret itihasa itself, right? Should we call it history? Should we call it mythology? Should we call it philosophy? It doesn't matter that much to me, but sure, I mean, there's some debate and discussion around it. How do you see it being relevant for the present times? I think that is the greater question.
No, firstly, on the first part of a question, I can think of many writers who have more talent than me, could have probably done a better job. I just got lucky that Lord Shiva blessed me with these stories. Why he blessed me, I don't know. But like I said earlier, I had written no fiction before Immortals of Meluva. Absolutely nothing. I genuinely believe it's the blessings of Lord Shiva. So, no, there are many, I think, writers who would have been better than me. I'm lucky. Lord Shiva blessed me. As far as this discussion around history, mythology, philosophy is concerned, this entire debate is a problem of the English language. Right? Remember, a language always reflects the culture that the language emerged from. Right. These discussions wouldn't even arise if we were speaking in Sanskrit. Right? Because, in Sanskrit, there is no subject where truth is privileged. There is no subject which claims that it has a right to absolute truth. That this is the truth. And
there is no
if you don't believe the truths, then God will punish you and you'll go to hell where you'll burn for eternity. That's a very childish. Honestly, I'm just being honest. It's a very childish approach.
Yeah.
Why will God do that?
Yeah.
So in Sanskrit, there is a respect for multiple truths. Right? So this discussion doesn't even arise. The problem is our founding fathers in their, they did a lot of wise, good things, but they made one mistake in the Constituent Assembly debates. You should check out those debates. There was a debate on whether our national language should be Sanskrit or English. And you should check out those debates. Many of the people supporting Sanskrit were actually Dr. Ambedkar, were many South Indian MPs.
Yeah.
They were the ones supporting Sanskrit. And others said, no, it should be English. And what has happened because of that is the role that Sanskrit used to play of being the link language. All of us would have Sanskrit as a link language, and then we would have our the language of our region as well. So someone like me, since I'm from UP, I would have known Sanskrit if we had followed that system. I would have known Sanskrit and Hindi, which is essentially Hindavi, right? Which is the derivation of Apa Brahmasha.
That's also how Suhail Dev speaks to the Chola Emperor, right?
Yeah. True, because the link language was Sanskrit.
Yeah.
And Sanskrit and the regional language were mutually intelligible. You could broadly understand, which is why you'll see that you'll find that Sanskrit speakers are much more, they find it easier to understand South Indian languages.
Yeah.
As compared to pure Hindi speakers, because Hindi has a lot of Persian words in it, a lot of Arabic words in it, right? You'll notice that often Sanskrit words are pronounced more correctly by native Marathi speakers or native South Indian language speakers. Like they'll say Gruha, for example. Whereas Hindi speakers end up saying Griha, which is actually not it's actually Gruha, right? In Sanskrit. Right? So the link language, which could have been Sanskrit, now became English. English is the link language. And the problem is English and our regional languages are mutually unintelligible. Not even are there no common words. The basic core of the language itself is different.
Yeah.
Like in English, the one male god is given respect. It's written with a capital G. But in English, the female goddess is given disrespect. She is written with a small g. This reflects the culture that English emerged from. Right? And when you speak to English native speakers on this, they'll tell us grammar rules. But basically, it reflects the culture where they privilege the one male god over the goddess.
Yeah.
In Sanskrit, that is not true. The male god and the female goddess are given equal respect in the language. The words that are used. So these questions arise simply because we are speaking in English. Because in English, it is believed that history is the truth and mythology is untruth. Right? And this becomes a subject of debate. Whereas in Sanskrit, the word we would use is itihasa. Thus it happened. Right? In which some of the things could be factual, some of the things could be metaphorical to convey a philosophical message. Because our ancestors were very clear, the purpose of a story to you is to convey some philosophical messages to you. Not for you to get into a silly debate of what is the truth and what is There are multiple truths. Ekam sat vipra bahudha vadanti. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is these questions arise simply because sadly for us in India today, the link language has become English. And there is the pressure of jobs. I don't know if this will ever change. I mean, my parents made a choice, right?
Yeah.
That the children have to learn English and from an economic perspective, ended up being the right choice, right? 4 of us have done well in life.
Yeah.
I was asked a question at Jagran Samaroh, which is organized by Dainik Jagran, the largest Hindi language newspaper in the world. And I live in Maharashtra. I was born in Mumbai. My father is from UP. So my Hindi is good. I can speak Hindi without using any English word in it. And I was speaking in Hindi on the stage. And then someone in the audience asked me that your Hindi is good. Why didn't you write in Hindi? Why did you write in English? And then I counter questioned him. I said, you tell me honestly, if I had written in Hindi, would you have called me to the stage and made me a keynote speaker out here? You've called me because I've written in English. It may be a harsh truth, but it is the truth.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
So now this is the culture. What do we do? How do we change it?
Yeah.
So this has a momentum of its own. And English has limitations because of the culture the language emerged from. Like, for example, the privileging of the one male god over the goddess. This is not a problem in most other cultures in the world because ancient traditions are not alive in most cultures in the world. But in India, ancient traditions are alive. We are the last surviving goddess worshipping culture. So for us, it is a problem.
Yeah.
Right? And there are many problems like this in the English language.
Mm.
How do we solve it? I don't know. We raise the issue, I guess. Maybe adapt English to our own traditions.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Or revive Sanskrit. I don't know what the solution is.
yeah, you're absolutely right. The lens in which we examine a lot of our daily experiences is Western right now, right? For better
True.
or for worse. That's a universal.
Yeah, and you're from Karnataka.
Yeah.
What the link language for the two of us 500 years ago would have been Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Right? Today, the link language is English. Right?
Yeah.
For example, I love S.L. Bhairappaji's books. I'm a big fan of this.
Yeah.
Right? But I can't read in Kannada. I don't understand Kannada. So I'm forced to either read in Hindi or English.
Yeah.
But if it was 500 or 1,000 years ago, both and both of us would have known Sanskrit. His books would have been in Sanskrit. I would have read it. That's a problem. The link language is English, and English does not have roots in India, so it does not reflect our culture. So therefore, many of our concepts simply cannot be expressed in English.
Yeah.
That is a core problem. I don't know what the solution is. Either we adapt. It's one of two. Either we adapt English into the Indian approach, or we revise Sanskrit. These are the only two approaches.
Right. So I think Rajiv Malhotra ji has a interesting way of resolving this. He says we should
Sanskrit
adopt
untranslatables,
untranslatables into the English language and
I think
make it part
that's a
of the
wise choice.
vocabulary.
That's a wise choice, and that is one approach. I'm not denying that.
Yeah.
But will it be a complete solution? It's difficult because because English is so enmeshed in the culture it emerged from. We have to change the language itself.
Yeah.
Like, I'd had a debate once on this. Why should goddess be written with a small g? Right? Earlier, I used to surrender to this grammar rule. Now, by God's grace, my books sell enough. So I insisted with my publisher, no, I'm a polytheist. I'm an idol worshipper. I respect the goddess as well. So goddess will also be written with a capital G. Gods will also be written with a capital G. My publisher agreed. My books are written that way. But excerpts of media houses, one particular media house I won't name, they refused to publish my excerpt because they said, no, goddess should be with a small g.
Wow.
Because that's a grammar rule. And I said, Saleh, I was extremely upset. Right. Okay, so and I spoke to my publisher, and I had a valid point that that website was, and because they were telling me, that you don't understand grammar rules, perhaps because of your background, you don't understand grammar rules. That's what I was told.
Wow.
So I said that, and my publisher was, like I said, very nice people. They were arguing, and then I told them that this same website is very happy to destroy grammar rules when a woke transgender from the US has a favored pronoun. Does that follow English grammar rules? No. But they're willing to destroy grammar rules for that. So if a white transgender wants to break the grammar rules, these guys will accept it. But a goddess worshipping Hindu wants to break the grammar rules, they will remind me of the inviolability of the English grammar rules. We withdrew the excerpt. We refused to release the excerpt in that website. But this is the problem in a language which does not have roots in India. And ideal solution would have been if our founding fathers had made a different decision 70 years ago. We would have been speaking. Israel revived Hebrew. Yeah. Why couldn't we revive Sanskrit? But now I don't know. It's gone too far. I don't know if it can be turned.
Yeah,
it's gone too far.
Yeah.
There are 150, 200 million people now who speak English reasonably well. Many more trying to learn because it's the language in which you get jobs. It's a link language for people across.
Right.
How do you change this now? So Rajiv Malhotra ji's solution is a good solution. That's one way. The other way could be revise Sanskrit, which is a very hard process. I won't deny it. It'll take a generation or two, and we may not find the enthusiasm for it. I admit.
Yeah.
Or a third route can be adapt English, adapt the grammar rules of English to Indian to an Indian approach to our culture.
Yeah. No, it
And
is.
those who don't like it,
Yeah.
too bad.
Yeah.
It's our culture. We'll adapt English to our culture.
It is a negotiation at the end of the day, right? I mean, you have to, if language articulates the thoughts you have and the lived experiences you have, I mean, it has to reflect
True.
that reality as well, right? So, uh,
And this is a philosophy that Westerners have accepted.
hmm.
Many of our, the elite or the media who reminded me of the grammar rules on Goddess, they respect the Western liberals, but the Western liberals have accepted that language can be adjusted.
Yeah, it is malleable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As they have adjusted it for the transgender experience. So why can't you adjust it for us goddess worshippers? Why not? Are we children of a lesser god?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, yeah, that's it's a wider discussion. And, for the time being, I don't know if, as you rightly mentioned, your books would have the same kind of appeal if you adopted this entirely new paradigm without it being accepted norm at this point of time, right? So it is what it is, I would say. And, coming to your latest book, why did you write Suhail Dev? What was the inspiration behind it? And, if you can take us through the process leading to that.
I discovered the story of King Suhail Dev at a conference in Goa, actually, from two friends, Abhinav Prakash and Sanjeev Sanyal, both scholars. And I was so inspired by the story. And at the same time saddened that I hadn't even heard, and I'm from UP. Okay, my mother's family is from MP, but my father's family is from UP. I hadn't heard of King Suhail Dev. How sad is that?
Yeah.
One of the most consequential heroes of the last millennium. And we hadn't even heard of him. And such an inspiring story. Someone who brought Indians of all communities together, fought one of the most brutal invaders, the most brutal foreign invaders the world has ever seen. The Turks were the military superpower of the day from the 11th to the 16th, 17th century. And, Spartans, Nazis, they're nothing compared to the Turks. The world hasn't seen warriors like that. They were built for just one thing and one thing alone, killing. That's it. Yeah. Their entire community, it was built around killing. For that period I'm talking about. The Turks and the Mongols, they were the key, military superpowers. And the Mongols declined as a military superpower by the 13th, 14th century. Turks continued to remain a military superpower till the 16th, 17th century, by which time then they started calming down and civilizing and then started losing battles. Like Timur, for example, was a Turk. Turks are originally from Central Asia. They're not from Turkey.
Yeah.
They conquered much of the known world, destroyed much of the known world. Not just India, the Arab world, Europe, and everywhere. Timur killed 5% of the world's population 800 years ago. Okay. Now think about it. 800 years ago, killing 5% of the world's population was not easy. There were no nuclear bombs. There were no. Yeah, it was in practical terms, a logistical challenge. There were no nuclear bombs. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no dynamite. There were no machine guns. You had to kill rifles. You had to kill the hard way, stab, behead. How do you kill 5% of the world's population?
Insane.
That way. Can you imagine the sheer brutality of that army? Right? They were built for warfare, nothing else. Most of the Turkic empires, the Turks were the ruling class and the warriors. The administrators were often Arabs or Persians because they used to find administration below them. They were only about warfare, right? Which is why most Turkic empire records are either in Persian or Turkic. So an army of that brutality, the Ghaznavids were Turks as well. Mahmud Ghazni was a Turk.
Yeah.
They came to India, and they ran into King Suhail Dev out here. And he gave such a devastating defeat to them that they didn't come back to India for 150 years, 160 years, the Turks. At the same time, when they were going around massacring much of The rest of the known world, they didn't come back to India for 160 years. Shouldn't we know the story of this hero
Yeah.
who did this? And why has he been airbrushed out of our history? So I wanted to set it right in my own small way. So I decided I'm going to write this book.
Yeah, it's a truly fantastic story, right? And so a lot of what you bring out in the story and in your writing also, a lot of these profound civilizational aspects. And, you know, I mean, you weave the fiction elements very, very seamlessly with Itihasa or whatever's happened, right? Or whatever we know has happened, right? How do you do that? I mean, how do you go about doing that? Do you pick a context and then do you weave, what do you decide to weave in? And, you know, if you can take us through some of that structuring and so on.
You know, how it works for me, I know some people laugh at it. I don't care. I genuinely believe my books are the blessings of Lord Shiva. Okay? I genuinely believe it. And my task is to, it's like if you're a chef, you need to buy the ingredients, right? If you don't have the ingredients, then how will you make the dish, right? So if you want to make, you know, I don't know, white sauce pasta or pasta aglio olio, whatever that's called, right? And you'll need the pasta, you'll need olive oil, you'll need those basics, right? Without it, how can you cook, right? But just because you have those ingredients doesn't mean that the dish will turn out well.
Yeah.
There is some magic that happens, right?
Yeah.
For the dish to turn out well. That's the way it works with me. My task is to gather as much knowledge as I can. Right?
And let it brew.
Those are the ingredients. Those are the ingredients. So luckily, because of the family background that I have, I've learned a lot of our culture from there. In my family, everyone reads a lot. Okay, I'm the dumbest guy. Okay, in my family. And because everyone reads a lot, I read a lot. It's a habit, you know. Your children don't do what their parents tell them to do. They do what they see their parents doing.
Yeah.
Since both my parents used to read a lot, all four of us siblings, all of us read a lot. It's just a habit. So I read at least 5-6 books a month. I've been reading at that pace for decades. Right?
Wow.
So all that knowledge goes there somewhere in the back of the mind. I love traveling. Okay? I love traveling to historical places. And even when I travel, I like to meet with locals. I like to, again, just draw inspiration, put all that knowledge somewhere in the back of the mind. I discuss a lot of philosophies with my family, you know, civilizational issues, various, with my family and my close friends. And one doesn't do that because one is thinking that I'm going to put it in some book. One just does it because one likes it. It's just like, I don't do research for the purpose of putting into a book. Like whenever I'm not writing, I see it as my time for research, reading, writing.
Interesting.
Discussing. Now all that goes in the back of the mind. How it comes together into the story, that's up to Lord Shiva. He somehow structures it in the way that the philosophies, thoughts just come in naturally in there. And look, my books, on average, they're long. They're 400, 500 pages. I've written 8 books in 10 years. It's a pretty damn good pace.
Yeah, they're prolific.
There is no way. I mean, it is, if someone believes that, you know, that it is my creativity, that's nonsense. How can I be this creative? It is the blessings of Lord Shiva. And it comes together just into the book. And my job is just to channel it. I open the laptop. I actually see that the events, the universe, and I record what I see. That's how it works for me. So it's all Lord Shiva's blessings. I buy the ingredients. How it comes together is the Mahadev.
It's very interesting, you know. I'm also a musician, and when I talk to some of the better musicians I know, and you know, as a kid, you're always thinking of what cool new things you can learn, right? So is there a scale that I can learn that I will end up playing like X, Y, or Z? And people I've always asked have said something similar, which is that, hey, you know, you can go and learn all of these scales, but then, I mean, it's what you call flow, right? I mean,
exactly. Where you can't even explain where it's coming from.
Yeah.
It just comes.
Yeah. That's amazing. And, you know, a lot of the themes that come out in the book, right, are very deep and profound civilizational themes, as I mentioned earlier as well. So one of the things you talk about is caste, right? And through the characters that you talk about, now you are clearly opposed to caste as it stands today, right? In fact, I mean, I've heard you say that you've dropped your last name as well on the same, in protest, right? So one of the interesting discussions I found in the book was between Ajit Pal and Mangal Dwaj, right? And they're talking about, karma-based, how should I call it? Karma-based duties and, birth-based, right? So how do you contrast this? And do you see that some of this is relevant even in today's context?
Firstly, I should clarify, yeah, I don't use my surname on the cover of my books, but that is true. But I never use the word protest.
Yeah.
Protest has this Western, no, why are you saying sorry? I'm just, again, it's the limitations of the English language, right?
Right.
English, you'll find everything becomes very adversarial. You notice that? That even when we're, even when.
So if you don't subscribe, if you don't subscribe to something,
I don't use the word protest. Yeah. You know that, I mean that it's like, I mean, for me to support one side, I have to hate the other side. See? Okay. And which is not the Indian way. Okay. In the Indian, there's this lovely book called The Vada, that is spoken of a lot by Radha Vallabh Tripathi. You should read that. It's about the Indian knowledge systems and debating systems and how it was a civilized way to debate. Right? Where the perspective was, how do I find something that I can learn rather than how do I show the other guy down? Right? And protest comes from there. Like, it is unique in the Indian way. Mahatma Gandhi didn't invent the concept of satyagraha. It was there much earlier. The concept that the person, quote unquote, protesting against the ruler would self-harm. Like the protester would self-harm and the ruler would be compelled to help. This is a uniquely Indian thing. It doesn't happen in, in the modern day, many have got inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and done this. But in ancient times, you didn't find that because protesters are about to take out a sword and kill the other guy, right? But it's like from like the story of Kannagi, for example, in South India. What is that? She was the moral force of her, forced the king to acknowledge the wrong that had been done to her husband. Right? Now, it's a unique way, right, of the Indian way. So it's not like protest. It's just in my own small way, my statement that what we have done over the last, 1,000, 1,500 years is wrong, is immoral, is adharma. And we should try and go back to the ways of our ancestors. Judge me for my karma. Ideally, don't judge at all. But if you have to, look at my karma. Don't look at where I was born. Look at me as Amish. Don't look at what I inherited, which is Tripathi. Dr. Ambedkar, coming then to the caste question. Dr. Ambedkar in Who Are the Shudras had studied textual sources to show that the caste system was actually, not birth-based, but was merit or karma-based. Right? Till somewhere around 1,500 to 1,500 years ago, when things started becoming rigid and birth-based, started ossifying. Interestingly, give or take a few centuries, this matches genetic data as well when intermingling stopped between various, Indian communities. And one of the markers of a birth-based caste system is the beti roti rishta stops. That intermarriage and eating together, that stops. Right? So genetic research is backing what Dr. Ambedkar had. Read the Bhagavad Gita, for example. Lord Krishna says very clearly, Chaturvanyam Maya Shrushtam Guna Karma Vibhagasha, that Lord Krishna created the 4 varnas on guna and karma, right? Your attributes and your deeds. Birth is not mentioned anywhere. Right? One of the Raj Purohits of Lord Ram, of the Ayodhya royal family, according to the Valmiki Ramayana, was Maharishi Satyakam Jabali, the originator of the Jabali Upanishad. Maharishi Satyakam Jabali was the son of a single Shudra mother. He did not even know who his father was. No one cared. right?
Right.
Because his birth was not important. What was important was his karma. He was a Maharishi. Forget about being a Brahmin, he was a Maharishi. Right?
Even
We had women Rishikas.
yeah.
So it's not just a question of caste, even gender. The Rig Veda has hymns written by Rishikas. As I've always said, I've said very often that there are idiots today who say women shouldn't read the scriptures. Women used to write the scriptures a few thousand years ago. How dare you say they can't read the scriptures? That is what our original culture was. Can we revive that? Because what we are doing today, where it's based on birth, is adharma, is immoral. And equally so, you will find that there was invaders used to try to come to India for centuries, right, for millennia. Why? Because the richest lands in the world, the settled lands, were always attacked by what were the nomadic warrior tribes, right? So China, the Roman world, India, the Golden Crescent, which is Iraq, which are the settled lands, would often get attacked by nomadic warrior hordes, Germanic tribes, Huns, Turks, Mongols, who used to come from the highlands or Central Asia. This was the way, the way of history. Those invaders used to come to India, they used to get beaten back almost every time. Okay, the Huns destroyed much of Europe. They won in Europe, and much of this sacking of Rome, etc. But in India, they were beaten back repeatedly. Read the tales of Skandagupta, for example. We're not taught all this in our history, sadly. Okay, so there was Alexander the Great, quote unquote. Right? He destroyed the Zoroastrian Persia empire of its time. But in India, he was fought to a standstill by a relatively minor king. Porus, whose actual name was either Puru or Parvateshwar. It's sad that so many Indians today actually think of his name as Porus. Shows how colonial our education system is. But Puru or Parvateshwar essentially ruled 1/5 of Pakistani Punjab. That's it. It was a small kingdom, right? And Alexander was fought to a standstill by this small kingdom. He didn't even fight the massive Nanda Empire, which was a superpower of the day. Right? So there was a time we used to beat back every invader. And then something happened from the 11th century onwards, where we started losing repeatedly to invaders. Did we suddenly become less brave? I don't think so. And yes, there were pacifist traditions in India, but the pacifist traditions didn't emerge 1,000 years ago. They emerged much, much earlier.
Before that.
The oldest pacifist traditions in the world are in India. Jainism, which is the oldest pacifist tradition in the world. It's from India. But we used to beat back invaders. We need to study why we lost so often. One of the reasons, I believe, is we divided ourselves. Because we made what we call the caste system today rigid, where Varna and Jati were two different things. We ended up combining the two. So fighting against the caste system the way it is today is not just a dharmic thing to do, is not just a moral thing to do, it's also the patriotic thing to do.
True. Yeah.
That's the way I see it.
Yeah. And I'm, absolutely optimistic. Like, my friend Harsh Gupta also says that, this will disappear as economic prosperity, with time, right? So the other, sorry, you were saying?
But let's not stop the hard work. Let's not assume it will disappear by itself.
Yeah.
Let's not assume that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to, all of us who are patriotic, who know our ancient culture, who are dharmic, we need to fight this.
Yeah.
For the good of Mother India.
Yeah.
And for dharma.
Yeah.
We need to fight it.
So the other recurring theme, right? And there's this duality between, pacifism and, fighting for what's right and fighting for what's true, fighting for your motherland. Right? The India that we know right now, the founding of India was recognized for Gandhiji's concept of ahimsa parmo dharma. But we've kind of ignored the following lines in that quote, right? Which is dharma himsa tataiva cha, right? So this pacifist outlook that we have is also the dilemma that Ashwa Ghosh faces in the book. And, Suhail Dev talks about it in various parts on how it's the rightful thing to do in defense of your motherland. Could you talk about that a little more, the whole dualism between pacifism and also doing what's right?
I think one of the key lines that most of us Indians should learn is Ati Sarvatra Varjayit. It comes down from our tradition that excess of anything is not, should be avoided. Extremes of anything is not. Ahimsa Paramo Dharma is there in the Mahabharata. Dharma Ahimsa Tathevcha is another line, which is not in the Mahabharata, but it has been spoken of. But if you see the concept of balance, then in the traditional Indian way, the approach is we must have a balance to everything. So we certainly shouldn't, turn to an extreme where we find, nobility in poverty, and so we will not, chase money. The silly socialist approach that we adopted pre-1991, where businessmen are seen like thieves and silly, stupid attitude. I mean, if you're not going to have businessmen, who will create the wealth to take care of the poor people? Someone needs to create wealth. But at the same time, if you swing to the other extreme, that we know a country to our north which has gone so mercantile that they have actually lost their own culture. It's an ancient culture. It's a beautiful culture. They've lost a lot of it in the last 78. One feels sad on that. Because it's the only other land which can claim to have a civilizational state besides India, China. China is not as ancient as us, of course. We are a pre-Bronze Age civilization. China is probably around 2,500 years old. So it's a much younger civilization than India, but it is a civilizational state. And how do you ensure that you don't swing on either extreme? Where you start, becoming a silly socialist moron, frankly, who ensures the destruction of the economy and poverty for everyone, except for
the people administering
the proletariat or the people who run the dictatorship in the name of the people. Right? So they will remain rich, like in some other countries. But how do you ensure that you don't swing to the other extreme as well, where your entire culture just becomes about money, and you lose the rest of it as well? So balance. You should have that same approach to non-violence and violence as well. If a society becomes so violent that there is complete chaos in the country all the time, how will culture emerge? How will knowledge emerge? How will business emerge? Look at the country to our west, Pakistan. There's so much random violence. Right? How do you even make that country stable? Right? So you can't have excess violence. But if you have excess non-violence, then how do you defend yourself? If you lose the ability to defend that which is precious, then you will lose that which is precious.
Right.
And we tried it. And that was like one of the theories of the last millennium, besides, of course, the caste system dividing us also, is that did we get too pacifist? That's why I put this debate. So again, we should have a balanced approach, towards it. So, for example, citizens like you and I, we have no right to take the law in our own hands. We have the right to protest if we want to. We're a democracy. We're not an authoritarian country. But we have no right, no Indian lay citizen has the right to take the law into his or her own hands and commit acts of violence. If you do that, you need to feel the full force of the law. Okay? But for us to say that our army guys, our police officers, they should not, they should also be completely non-violent. Boss, I mean, hum log lallu hai kya phir? Who will defend us? Someone has to defend us, no? Right. Who will defend us? Our warriors, right? Our soldiers, our police officers, our rapid action forces, our the police, the armed police services. They are ones who will defend us. So we have to defend their right to carry out violence under the rule of law, right? So again, that's a balanced approach. Like if a Pakistani terrorist, comes to our border, we don't want a soldier, an Indian soldier, dropping his gun and reading, and maybe speaking the Bhagavad Gita or the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad to that terrorist to try and reform him.
Right.
What our soldier needs to do is pick up his gun and shoot the other guy, and shoot that Pakistani terrorist, right? So again, balanced approach. Don't swing on either extreme.
Right.
That's perhaps the debate I'm trying to trigger with this discussion.
Right. So much of dharma itself is contextual, right? What constitutes dharma and adharma, and it comes out beautifully in the book at many different places, right? And this duality of nothing is black or white, but you sort of live with the consequences of your actions, right? Just a recurring theme throughout. How do you personally define dharma? I mean, it seems very difficult to sort of intellectually wrap your head around it, but sort of you can instinctively understand certain elements of it, right? So how would you define dharma?
Our ancestors have debated dharma for millennia. There are no easy answers. Okay? And the ancient Indian way of life is not for children. It's for grown-ups. Okay? And by that, I'm not meaning physically children or physically grown-ups. I'm saying people who are mentally adult or mentally children. So God is not going to come and tell you, do this, otherwise you'll go to hell. That's like prescriptive. That's treating you like a child.
Yeah.
Our divine beings will give you knowledge, will give you context, and you learn from those archetypes, and then apply the lessons in your own life, and then make your decisions, and then live with the consequences, positive or negative. So God does not judge you. No one judges you. Everything that happens to you is in your own hands. It's in some ways a very empowering philosophy, because you're not waiting for God sitting on a sad height to decide what will happen to you. No, you decide by yourself through your karma. And therefore, to make these choices, one of the key things is to understand is to explore dharma. And one of the key things our ancestors used to tell us is to understand dharma. The key thing you need to learn is this concept called viveka. Okay. That was a part of our traditional education system, and viveka would be taught to you through stories. Right? What is viveka? It is the ability to understand the context. Like we were debating about, non-violence and violence. How do you decide what is the correct context, right, to do violence or non-violence? You need viveka. Right? The ability to, and this applies in all aspects of life. Right? Because you can understand choices, decisions only through context, right? Through understanding what the situation is. So, like once or twice I've done this at some events. There is this Urdu ghazal, "Baat niklegi to dur talak jayegi." I don't know if you heard that one.
No, I haven't heard.
"Baat niklegi to dur talak jayegi, log bevajah udasi ka sabab puchenge." So it's a lovely, Urdu ghazal, and I've done this exercise often, that you see the words, and I encourage your readers to Google it and read the words. And then if they read it the first time, I'm sure they'll think it's a very romantic, beautiful ghazal, right? Baat niklegi to dur talak jayegi. It's a man speaking to his lover. And then I say, okay, now let's change the context. Okay. And see if those same words in that ghazal, the meaning of it changes for you. So I said, okay, let's think of a context where the man is actually a Nawab, right? A rich person who comes from a very old family, educated, elite, and he is in love with a woman. He's saying these words to a woman, and the woman is a courtesan. Okay. And he is in love with her, but he's a weakling. He's not going to fight his family and his parents to marry the courtesan that he loves. Right? Now, this is the situation. Read the same ghazal again. What meaning do you draw from it? You read the same words and almost everyone tells me the man is an asshole. He's a weakling, right? And he wants to protect his izzat. So he's essentially telling his woman, don't talk of this because people will trouble you. People will ask you questions, right? Essentially, that's what the ghazal is. Don't talk of me, right? That's what the man is saying. And in fact, in one of the times I've done this, the woman in the audience said, "You've destroyed a ghazal, which was for me one of my most romantic ghazals." So then I said, "Okay, let's change the context again." And I said, now, say the context is, it's not a Nawab and a courtesan. Say it's a husband and wife. Okay. The husband is still a Nawab. Okay. And the wife is his Begum. And he treats her like a princess. He takes care of her. Okay. And she's completely dependent on him. Okay. And he loves her obsessively. Now, imagine that the situation is that the man is dying. And he knows he has very little time left. He knows there's enough money to take care of his beggar. But he's not sure how she'll live without it. Right? Can she actually face the world? Will his relatives, will they trouble her? Does she have the mental strength to fight them? Okay. Will they bring up the subject of her dead husband, of her, of her being a widow, to break her? Okay. He said, now imagine this is the context. Read the words of the same ghazal, same words, read it all over again. Okay. And then the audience says it's the most romantic ghazal ever. Right? And then I asked, so does the man love her? He says he loves her obsessively because he wants to take care of her even after his death.
Right.
Right? And he's telling her, this is how you'll be. Don't talk of me because they will taunt you. Right? Don't show your tears in public. Right? Keep me to yourself. And it's the, and there were, there's a line in there, churiyon pe bhi tang kase jayenge, that, people will ask questions on your bangles. Right? And a person had said this, that when I gave the interpretation of the Nawab and courtesan, he said those bangles must have been gifts from the Nawab, so he doesn't want her to show it. Right? And then the same thing, when she's a widow, he says they will ask questions that if she's a widow, why is she wearing bangles? And he wants to tell her, get a damn, wear your bangles. Right? The same words, the same poem. You change the context, the meaning changes completely. What you draw from it changes completely. So the key lesson in this is for you to develop viveka, to develop the ability to understand context. Because if you do that, that is a key step in developing the ability to understand dharma. So this was one of the things that was taught to us repeatedly through our stories. Have the ability to understand context.
Yeah, context is so important. I'm also reminded of this. I don't know if you've heard this Police song called "Every Breath You Take," Sting.
Yeah.
So that's exactly like a government.
Some people think it's a romantic song. Some people it's a bloody stalker song. Again, it's a context.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
But that's a key thing. That it's not just the words.
Yeah.
Understand the context, and then you'll lead a better life, a more dharmic life.
Yeah. And
so our tradition kind of treats you like an adult. Our tradition is become an adult and make your choices and live with it. Don't be a child. No one is going to come and tell you do this.
Yeah. I think it's not so prescriptive, right? It's not like,
it's not prescriptive at all.
It's not do this, do that, or whatever. It's I mean, it's recognizing that things may not be the same. Things may evolve, and you have to do what's right by the situation, right?
Exactly. So therefore, Lord Krishna is also right in what he did, and Lord Ram is also right in what he did.
Yeah.
Again, it's a context. It's a context.
Yeah. So the other thing, one is, sort of acutely aware, reading the pages of the book, you also understand how much of sacrifice went into our way of being right now, right? To retain our way of being. And, that's again, a recurring thing throughout the book, right? How much people suffered to uphold whatever our culture, our rituals are, that we take for granted at this point of time. Simple things like going to a temple or doing puja and stuff like that. And Suhail Dev's monologue at the end explains that beautifully, right? He says God is everywhere, but then the importance of this. Again, I don't want to give away too much, but it's a very beautiful monologue. Do you want to talk about the importance of rituals as such? How important it is, for a culture?
Look, we are not a congregational religion. Okay, the dharmic paths, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism,
It's a personal experience.
Yeah. So so religion kind of teaches us the personal experience. Where does the communal, by communal, I'm meaning it in a positive way, not the negative, not communal as in hating someone else,
right,
but communal as in the community kind of coming together. Where does that happen? It happens through our rituals and through our festivals. Because it's not that we meet, that everyone meets at a particular temple on a particular day of the week. No, it's a personal region. And in fact, the days can differ. The days for Lord Hanuman, for example, differs depending on the region you are in, either Tuesday or Saturday.
Right.
So you don't even have a same day for the same.
Sorry, I was saying it's like these interest groups, right? I mean, it's
and we all have our, and it is encouraged.
Yeah.
We should find our own path. Nothing wrong with that. That is actually a guarantor of liberalism. Because all of us have a right to our own truth. So then where does the community feeling come from? Comes from our festivals, comes from our rituals. Because in those festivals, everyone comes together, right? Which is why that you will find for us, our festivals are so important. Which is why you will find so many of us react negatively when Western or Westernized people attack our festivals. Because we are not a congregational way of life, the dharmic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. Our festivals are very, very important. Which is why, like in some of my books, for example, when, modern issues come into my books, in some ways. So when Jallikattu was being attacked, the Tamil festival, I wrote of it in Sita, Warrior of Mithila. I showed Lord Lakshman participating in Jallikattu. We're not going to stop it. Now, if some wrong things are being done, of course, it can be, if there's animal cruelty happening, it can, very happy to reform.
But
the festival will not stop. Yeah. It will not stop. And this is true of Jallikattu. This is true of Kampala in Karnataka. It is true of Dahi Handi. We will not stop, right? Because it is central to our way of life. It's these festivals where we come together. Now, many may not verbalize this as clearly, but it's something very instinctively there. We know the importance of our festivals. Because we are not a congregational, the four dharmic religions, we are not congregational religions. Our festivals are very important. So we will not stop it. And one doesn't care what the Western or the Westernized people say. If there are reforms needed, we're very happy to. But those festivals will continue. They will not stop. That keeps us together. And we have to realize what is core to our way of life. And our ancestors fought hard for it.
Yeah.
And we cannot surrender. We'll not stop.
Yeah. So there's at the core of it, there's this dichotomy of India being a 73-year-old nation and a civilization of like many thousand years, right? That's the central schism in the country's narrative and discourse in anything that you speak, and it seeps through in all of the present day issues that we talk about as well, right? How do we make our people own that heritage and culture? And perhaps, I mean, you could talk about your current role at the Nehru Center as well in relation to that.
there are only two civilizational states in the world: China and India. Japan, sorry, three. Japan to some extent. Japan as well. So three civilizational states. But the most ancient one, the only pre-Bronze Age civilization which is alive till today, is India. And the problems in this arise because of the lack of knowledge. Ignorance makes us believe the lie that was told to us during the British Raj times, that the British created India and India did not exist. Many of us believe it also. I find so many people saying it publicly, which is not true at all.
Yeah.
And the biggest disinfectant will be knowledge. So one of the things I keep repeating, I've said it often, it's an area of personal passion for me. Our education system needs to be decolonized. It needs to be reconnected to our roots, because the biggest problem is our education system. Our education system keeps hammering these lies again and again, that India was never a country, that the British created us. Nonsense. You know, that you know, the lies that you know, ancient Indians never wrote, you know, we were an oral culture. Nonsense. There are many lies like this which Indians believe because of our education system. Let me address this question of civilization specifically. You know, when they say India was never a country before the British created it, they're talking of a nation in terms of a political nation state. Okay. The reality is there was no political nation state anywhere in the world before the treaties of Westphalia, which was in the 17th century, if I'm getting my dates broadly right. 17th or 18th century, I'm broadly in that, so relatively recent. Right? Nations did not exist as political nation states prior to the treaties of Westphalia. They existed as cultural concepts. Okay, so because the state was actually built around the sovereign, the king or the queen. So if in 15th century England you said you were loyal to England rather than King Henry, you would be beheaded as a traitor. So so there was no political. So if they say there was no political nation state in India before the 17th century, there was no political nation state anywhere in the world before the 17th century. Not in UK either. Right? So then the question arises, did India exist as a cultural concept before the British came? Right? Because they were cultural nations, right, before. Like Normandy, for example, for long was ruled by England, but culturally it was always French. Right? So so did India exist as a cultural concept? Hell yes. There's enough evidence for it. Okay. In oral traditions and in written traditions, the Vishnu Puran, for example, which is at the minimum 2000 years old, I believe it is a lot older. It says Uttaram yat samudrasya himadrashchaiva dakshinam varsham tada bharatam nama bharti yatra santatihi. That north of the ocean and south of the Himalaya lies the noble nation of Bharat, and there live the descendants of Bharat, which is the Indian subcontinent. Our ancestors were very clear. This is our land. Okay? This is Bharat, the Indian subcontinent. And this description is there in many texts. I use it repeatedly in my books as well. This description, north of the ocean, bound by the you know, and south of the Himalayas, this is our land. Right? So of course we were a cultural nation. Then it comes up obviously that we are a civilization state because we are inheritors of that civilization. But these things need to be taught. No? You can't blame the ordinary people for believing the lies that were told to us during the British Raj and sadly by our establishment historians who took over post the British Raj.
Yeah.
You can't blame the common people because, well, they were taught this. So then let's teach the truth. No? Let's teach the actual knowledge.
So some of our history is also talking about very difficult things like the invasions, right? Where I come from, again, there's evidence everywhere. But you know, if you go to Igutapa temple, for example, in Coorg, Again,
Tipu
I mean,
Sultan's
one of the
image
very
of
few
this.
temples that was spared, and there is this whole story of wild bees chasing away Tipu's army, right? Um, you talk about invasions in the book as well. S.L. Bhairappaji talks about it in Avarna, and few of those. There are similar instances of these in our history, right? How do we talk about it in a reasonable, rational way so that it doesn't induce any hatred against any particular sections of our society at this point of time? And yeah, I mean, if you could just talk about that a little bit.
For me, the golden rule which guides what I do is India above all else. That has to be the golden rule, right? Are we doing something that is in the interest of Mother India? Okay. One of the main reasons for some poison, fortunately, we are most Indians, forget the people who shout and scream on TV debates and the public square. They're made for each other. They're play acting for us to raise TRPs. Okay, most Indians of all communities actually are not on those extremes. Most Indians are in the center,
right?
Deeply patriotic, deeply liberal. Right? But part of the reason for the poison in the body politic is the fact that we've not made peace with our history. Will Durant, the American historian, brilliant historian, had said that perhaps the bloodiest invasion in human history was the Turkic invasion of India. We need to speak honestly of that history. Only then can we make peace with it. I have nothing but contempt for those who try and whitewash the horrific brutalities of people like Alauddin Khilji or Mahmud Ghazni or Aurangzeb. I mean, they were horrifically brutal people. They were Hitler times 500. Horrifically brutal people, and they've recorded it in their own, in their own texts. I mean, they're all available, on the web.
Yeah.
These texts are available,
Yeah, and we're proud about it.
The Alamgiri, Babarnama, Tariq-e-Farishte, the texts are all available. But at the same time, we have to realize that if we don't call the British colonial rule the Christian rule, why do we call the Turkic colonial rule the Islamic rule? Because somewhere in the back of the mind an image is given that they were Indian Muslims carrying out these crimes. Bollywood movies have added to this confusion. Again, you can't blame the Bollywood filmmakers because they've studied in the same schools that all of us studied in. So they believe the history that was taught to them. Right?
Yeah.
So in the popular Indian mind, Razia Sultan is seen as Hema Malini, or Alauddin Khilji is seen as Ranveer Singh, or Akbar is seen as Hrithik Roshan or Prithviraj Kapoor. Again, in the back of the mind, the image is given, they were Indians, just Indian Muslims. Right? Whereas when you show a British person, it's very clear there'll be a white-skinned guy. They would get a Tom Alter or a Bob Christo, someone to make it very clear, not Indian. Right? When the reality is those Turks, those Turkic invaders, to us Indians, they would have looked Chinese. They won't have looked Indian.
Yeah. And you make that point many times in the book.
Repeatedly in the book. I make it in the book. We have to understand that. They were not Indian Muslims. And those same Turks destroyed the Arab world as well. They massacred much of Eastern Europe as well. What was Greece was ethnically cleansed. The men were killed, the women were taken over, and that became Turkey. Because the Turks originally came from Central Asia. Went everywhere. They came to India as well. And to us, they would have looked Chinese. The Chinese can tell the difference between the Turks, the Central Asian Turks and themselves. But to us, they would have looked Chinese. They were foreigners. Practically all the Indian Muslims that are there today are descendants of either Hindus or Buddhists. Right? Again, Genetic tests can be done to prove that. But I wonder if those genetic tests are required, because we just have to look at them. Do they look Central Asian? They look like us. They're Indians.
Yeah.
So
it's always,
we have to differentiate that. It's like British colonial rule. We'll speak honestly of the brutality of it, but nowhere in our mind is it equated to Indian Christians. We have to speak honestly of the horrific brutality of Turkic colonial rule and realize it's not about Indian Muslims. That has to be understood by both Indian Hindus and Indian Muslims. I think that will hopefully take the poison out.
Yeah, it's hilarious to me that they got Hrithik Roshan playing Akbar, right? I mean,
and look, among the colonial rulers also, like among the British colonial rulers, there were some who were relatively decent, like Bentinck was relatively decent. Some who were horrific barbarians, like Robert Clive or Dalhousie. They were barbaric people. Right? It's the same with the Turkic colonial rulers too. Some of them were relatively decent actually. Okay, but many of them were among the most brutal men seen in human history. And we must speak honestly of that. We can't whitewash those crimes. And that will lead to more poison. Speak honestly, the truth will set us free. But at the same time, realize it has nothing to do with Indian Muslims.
Yeah.
We have to find that balance.
Yeah, there is the process of reconciliation that is missing, I feel, in our central narrative and discourse. Speaking of films, have you had offers to translate, to turn your books into films? I'm sure you would have. So who do you see playing? This is actually my wife's question. So she says, who do you see playing Suhail Dev? Who do you see playing Toshani, Abdul and Govardhan?
Okay, so what's your wife's name?
Prachi.
Prachi, okay. So my regards and to Prachi. In fact, actually, I've started my own studio in Mumbai. And we're a production company rather, not a studio. And my elder brother has joined; he's running it. We've also got Anish Tripathi. He's joined. We've also got a guy called Aman Gurwada who has 14-15 years of TV experience. Fantastic guy, and a team under them. So we are hoping to actually build Suhail Dev ourselves.
Oh, fantastic!
I will wait for Prachi's recommendations on who the actors and actresses should be.
I'm sure. She'll be more than happy to suggest a few names. So, Amish, this has been a fascinating conversation. It really could go on, but I'm very mindful of your time. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. As a parting note, we're sort of in difficult times at this point of time. And you are an ardent Shivji ka Bhakt, right? So what blessings would you, channel through Shivji for the rest of the world?
Erroneously in English, Lord Shiva is often called the god of destruction.
Yeah.
And again, like I said, the English language comes from its own cultural background. So destruction is a very loaded word. Pralay doesn't necessarily mean that. Because, in the Western way, they see destruction as the end of days, sub-sampler. Everything is finished.
It's like Noah's flood, basically.
Yeah. Whereas in the Indian way, it's very clear that destruction is the other side of creation. The immediate moment after the moment of destruction is the moment of creation, because we don't see time as linear, we see time as circular. So if it's from that perspective, then Lord Shiva is not, and the correct English term would not be the god of destruction. He would be the god of transformation, because nothing truly escapes the universe, right? The death of one form is actually the creation of another form. When we die, our bodies, when they are cremated, the chemicals will go back into another form, right? So are our bodies dead or just recreated in another form? So what we are seeing this year, it is a crazy year. Okay, it's one of those, like those the Justinian plague times, right? which shakes up the entire world, and a new world is created. This is certainly one of those years. Not just for it, across the world. It's not just about the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
China is having the worst floods in living memory.
Yeah.
India had, the locust attacks, the worst cyclone, up the east coast, a cyclone up the west coast. And who remembers a cyclone on the west coast? Right?
Yeah, it's insane.
This is happening like across the world. So this is one of those years of, see it as a year of transformation. Right? This is one of those years where the board will be shaken up, all the pieces will be thrown in the air, and how they land, we don't know. Then we have to play the game after that. Right? And a key competitive advantage in this is not necessarily wealth or army. It's the grit of the nation, the toughness of the people. Because you can't plan for something. How can you plan for? Ek ke baad ek, these things are happening. How can anyone plan for this? Right? Which means that you have to have the grit to take whatever comes at you and come out of it with as much of your Shakti, as much of your strength intact. That's what I wish upon not just India, but upon the entire world, except for those nations who want to do us harm. So that when we emerge from this crisis, hopefully we'll have as much of our strength intact as possible. Right. Then we'll build a better world. So remember, Lord Shiva is not the god of destruction. He's the god of transformation. In any transformation, there will be a period of chaos like this. It's the way the universe works.
Right. That's a fantastic note to end the podcast on. Thank you again, Amish. This is again one of those conversations I'll be revisiting often enough in the days to come. And folks, I cannot recommend Suhail Dev more highly. Please pick up a copy. It's a riveting read, something that every Indian should read. Pick up many different copies, in fact. Let me get a screen grab of this, actually.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, sorry. Did you get that? Sorry, did I move it away?
No, I got that. Yeah.
You got? Okay.
That was awesome. Thanks for tuning into another episode. The podcast will be published on all popular platforms. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.